And if you believe this, we should be live. Is everybody there?
I am. Are you?
Yep.
I think so. I
I'm
think
here.
so.
Yep.
Well, you
Sitting
look
here.
like just like yourselves. What's going on here?
It's amazing. You look more or less the way that you did 30 seconds ago before we were officially broadcasting ourselves out to the universe as a whole. So I don't know. And glancing at it, I think we have 7 whole people who might be looking at us right now. So.
Shall we commence?
I think so. All right, I'm going to start the
Festivities?
timer.
Well, let's. So
Fantastic.
50 years ago today, Apollo 13 encountered Houston. We have a problem. Jim Lovell was all over the television. Our good pal, Jim Lovell from Chicago, was all over the television this morning talking about this. Why don't we reflect a little bit on what Apollo 13 means to us now and some of the things that Jim has told us, which are really quite remarkable.
What are your personal memories from Apollo 13, Dave? We've got 2 of us that were actually live for this thing, and we have a third who remembers when the movie came out.
Yes.
So,
well, to me, I mean, it was a big deal, and it was very worrisome. And I remember hearing it was traumatic to people. I mean, I followed it really on a sort of a minute-to-minute basis when this became a crisis after the oxygen tank explosion. It doesn't live quite in the same way in my mind as, because I was very young at the time, and you weren't a whole lot older than me, Jeff, but it wasn't quite like Apollo 11 when we got the special permission to stay up late, when I was, 7 years old until 11 p.m., in the Eastern time zone, which, way beyond the rules to see the actual landing and the moonwalk. That was a big deal. But I remember the terrible fright, of Apollo 13 turning into an awful disaster. And as Jim told me, Jim Lovell, we've talked to him several times in Chicago, for the magazine, and he's told me, it was a very real fear that we thought for quite a long time there, we were going to turn into the first human popsicles in orbit.
what were they going to be popsicles, or were they going to be? I mean, you could be a popsicle and then you re-enter, right? So,
well, for quite a while they were going to be chilly.
Yeah,
before any reheating. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. My memory of it was, of course, growing up. I among my very first memories, or what I remember to be my first memories at least, were watching them buckle astronauts into the Mercury capsules. And the difference in our ages is probably such that I could claim to have memories of those, and you maybe can't quite.
That's right.
But so I grew up in the midst of that. In fact, I am, as are we all probably at some level, arguably here because of that going on back in the day. So yeah, we could do shows and shows and shows talking about memories of Apollo. But no, Apollo 13, the moment that I remember more than anything else from Apollo 13 was when I got up and I looked at the newspaper, and they had actually the picture of the service module that had been taken after the command module had separated, sitting there on the front page of the paper. And I think it was then that it sunk in for me just exactly what had happened there. It was kind of a funny story. After the movie came out, what year did the movie come out? Do you remember?
I think it was 94. 94 or 96, one of those two.
I bet it was 94 sounds more. But anyway,
1995, so it's in the middle.
90. There you go.
Right in the middle.
Not long after the movie came out, I was actually at Fermilab, and I was given a colloquium about Hubble stuff, and back in the day of all of the excitement surrounding that. And a bunch of us graduate students and I got together to eat. And there was this one graduate student that was just really, really, really annoyed by this new movie that had come out. And he said it was just crazy. It was this space movie, and it was just completely implausible, and it was just nothing like that. And he was talking about the movie Apollo 13. And it's like, do you not know that that's a true story? And of course, the next thought is to realize that the years must be passing. Had I gotten to the point that I could be talking to graduate students in physics who didn't know that Apollo 13 happened? But anyway.
It's amazing. The movie almost never happened the way it did as well, because one of the things that we talked to Jim about, there's a whole spectrum of among the Apollo astronauts, from, Frank Borman was the most, conservative, rigid, right, all the way over to Rusty Schweikart, to ASC, the hippie astronaut, as he has been called a couple of times, very liberal, very loose guy. Well, Jim Lovell, he's a sweet, sweet guy, but he really is an upstanding, he's a real Boy Scout, really all-American, sweet guy. He really is, still to this day. And they sent him the script, the producers, and Tom Hanks, of course, was involved, and others. And he opened the script, he told us, and Marilyn was there as well when we interviewed him the first time in Chicago. And he said, I couldn't believe it. I saw the word F on one of the pages, and I called them back in Hollywood and said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Okay, you're going to have to get some other people to be involved. Well, they discussed the whole thing. Tom Hanks got in with the producers, and they eliminated the language. And Jim Lovell was in on the project, and you can see he plays a bit part on the carrier near the end of the film. So that almost never happened the way it did, with the authenticity that it has, because of the F-bomb appearing in that script.
Funny. Gee,
I actually was reading a transcript. I was writing up something on it, I think last week, and I was reading the transcript from when they needed to basically use the sun to turn the capsule around and figure out, where are we, which direction is the sun and which direction is Earth. And so they ended up, using the I can't remember. Anyway, but once they get it, the transcript is, everyone's very excited, and they're like, yes, we got it. And then the last line is Jim Lovell basically saying, well, if we raised our voices there, it was justified. It was just like, yes, that sounds exactly like the man that we
It was an incredibly heroic thing, and it's such a, an amazingly thin sort of probability that they had to sort of rejigger the LEM in order to survive. And of course, poor Fred Hayes was just desperately sick. It really is incredible in reality, Hollywood aside, that they made it back to Earth as they did.
Yeah. Well, speaking of unmitigated disasters, how's life?
Ordinary week, ordinary month, ordinary year.
Yeah, right. It's
so let me ask you,
as the curse goes, may you live in interesting times.
And by golly, yes indeed, best of times and the worst of times. Now let me ask the two of you for your takes. When we go back to normal, as some in Washington and others not until a year more from now to begin with a vaccine, will we ever go back really to normal that we knew 3 or 4 months ago?
No, absolutely not. It is the thing that people don't realize about this thing. Oh, we're going to have this little blip, and then it's all back to normal, and the NFL is going to open up, and so on and so forth. If the NFL tries to have a game this fall, they can just name it the Pandemic Bowl and be done with it. The way this thing works is that the reason why the number of cases is falling is, of course, because we are locking things down. We are shutting things down. And, we know that. That's why it's an awful lot better time right now to be in Washington State than it is in someplace like Alabama, for example, certainly than New York. And because what's going to happen is this thing's going to pass, and because we're locking down, the numbers are going to come down, and people are saying, oh, let's just open it all up back up again. Isn't this wonderful? What they don't realize is that we are coming out of this first wave. We are going to be roughly as vulnerable to this thing as we were going into it.
Mhm.
Maybe something like 10% of the population will have had it, which means that there'll still be something like 90% of the population or thereabouts that is vulnerable. And if that doesn't sound like a really big difference, it's because it's not. And you look historically at what pandemics do, and they don't have one wave, they have multiple waves.
Mhm.
And there are all sorts of models that, okay, if we just open things up, then this is how long it takes for us to be right back where we are now. There are estimates that if we do that badly, we could easily be seeing 1 million or so deaths. And so I guess the question that we face is it worth dropping a bomb on a major city? Is it worth that kind of a human toll just so that we can get back to what's called business as usual? We might try, but it's not going to happen that way.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the temptation is going to be to open everything up and just let it go back to normal. And I think that's the key, is to resist that kind of temptation. And also to realize that normal is new normal, whatever we want to call it, is going to look different for different parts of the country. Obviously, it's going to look different for New York than it is for Waukesha, than it is for Tucson or Phoenix. There are places, obviously, that haven't had as many cases. But whether that's just because they have not yet been hit, or because they've got lower populations, or because everyone started working at home, there's a lot of factors, I think, that go into it that, say, the general population doesn't see, because we're only getting 1 or 2 messages, say, out of Washington. So it's going to have to look different.
The question that I have, everybody says, when are we going to get back to normal? My real question is, why in the world would we want to? It's normal had been working so beautifully well for so many of us. And if you look at what's going on, it's like, okay, people are finding they have to work from home. And that's another thing, by the way. If you look at all of these scenarios for what getting back to normal means, well, getting back to normal means that if at all possible, you still work from home. And if you're over 60, you still stay indoors, and you still don't get together with groups larger than about 50, and so on and so forth. And so and also other aspects of the back to normal is we can only get back to normal if we massively improve our healthcare and massively improve our public health infrastructure and put new programs in place to actually monitor who is who, so we can do close contact tracing and so on and so forth. All of which is supposed to be done by people who, during the run up to this thing in the first place, seemed incapable of finding their own head with both hands and a map. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when we try. And then this will be an interesting ride. This will be an interesting ride.
And this virus is not going to go anywhere. Eventually, everyone, all of us, eventually will be exposed to this virus. And barely, a vaccine, when it comes, is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve the problem permanently for everyone forever.
Well, talk about that. Talk about your thoughts about the vaccine.
And just quickly, part of that is because, on the third point, because this is a rapidly mutating virus.
That's who?
The news reports that I saw, unless they're wrong, over the last week.
I was reading an article where they were saying that the mutation rate kind of made it look more like maybe chickenpox or the measles or something like that was optimistic about longer immunity and utility of a vaccine.
So can a vaccine bring this under control whenever it comes, whether 6 or 9 or 18 months from now? Is that really a that will help to put the world more back to normal? And will there be at least companies, if not schools and other institutions, that learn economically because of the economic chaos that's going, at least, hand in hand with this for the time being, that we don't care if we can all run back into the building. It makes more sense economically not to work the old way, but to continue working in a more efficient, less expensive way, largely remotely, as we've been doing.
So, Allison, how do you find the working from home and not getting to see this gentleman's smiling face in person every day? Although
I can tell you that's a net gain for anyone, not having this.
I'll let that answer stand. But so I'm torn, like I've mentioned before. So I did work from home for many years. I'm used to it. But I personally prefer going into the office. I like having a very separate kind of work and, home space for me. I've not had a problem necessarily getting work done. It maybe happens during slightly different hours. It's a little harder to say, okay, I'm working from, 8:30 to 5, and then I'm done. I've been aiming for that. For me, it's a lot easier just to go in and say, when I'm in the office, I'm working, and when I'm not in the office, I'm not working, and my email is closed. And, I think it's kind of changed the dynamic. And again, some people function much better that way, and some people don't function as well that way. So I think it can depend. It could be a gain for a lot of people. I would really prefer being able to go back into the office. Obviously, when it's safe to do so, I'm certainly happy to work from home until then. But as soon as it is actually safe to go back to the office, my plan is to go back, because that, again, is just a system that works for me. Or, well, again, especially in, say, our field, where we're dealing with illustrations and layouts and things like that, it's very hard to communicate that over an email. It's a lot easier just to be able to walk over to the artist, and say, here is what I want, changed, or this is how I want this to look. So I think it's different for different companies too.
I look forward to having this conversation after you have been doing this for another couple of months.
Right. And maybe I may feel very differently. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's, as someone who, the majority of the work that I do is from home these days.
I think my concern too also is that I have a hard enough time getting up once an hour in the office, because I tend to get very focused on things, and I'll just stay sitting and doing things. And, obviously that's not very healthy. And I have an even harder time somehow doing that at home. I'm almost more focused, which in a way is worse for me health-wise, because I'm not standing up and walking to someone else's office.
There's an app for that.
There is, and I ignore it. So that's the problem.
There's
an alarm I have that goes off once an hour, and I just ignore it. And
no,
I did
there's an app that I have, and there are a variety of them out there that do things that are called pomodors, and I forget how this was named after some fruit or something. I don't know, but it it goes off however long you set it. It tells you stop, and it sort of it gripes at you. Yeah, you really are supposed to stop now. And then in 5 minutes, it tells you you're really supposed to come back now. And it gives you little perks. It helps you with the little dopamine bursts when you do what it is that it's telling you. And once you have successfully done several of these things, then it lets you take a long break, and it congratulates you mightily. And so I have managed to get, even before this thing hit. In fact, what got me into really taking it seriously, we hiked the Grand Canyon kind of 1st of March, 3,000 years ago, the 1st of March. And it was kind of a strange experience. I have to back up. Let's go back to Watergate days. This is another one that Dave remembers.
Oh, yes.
I was actually out canoeing in the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota, southern Canada, when Nixon resigned. And so when I went in, it was, I am not a crook. And I came out and it was President Ford. And so there's that whole piece of history that I am supposed to have lived through that for me is only read history. Same thing happened this time. We hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and I will say I managed at almost 62 years old to put a blankety blank heavy pack on my back and lug it down to the Colorado River and back out again. So I want brownie points for that. But we go down, and it's sort of still thinking, surely they're gonna start reacting to this thing in a reasonable way sooner or later, aren't they? And then about the time that we popped back out again, it was the proverbial had hit the fan, which is actually why by the time this thing is over, I'm going to look like the old man in the mountains, because I had sort of decided, all right, I'm going to go hike the canyon, so I'm just going to let my hair grow. And then I came back out again. So it's been a while since I've seen a barber, and will probably continue to be. But the point is that I have this funny history of being completely out of touch when the world changes. And it was sort of a strange experience this time.
That may be the biggest single problem that many of us face now, is not being able to get a haircut. or trusting your spouse as you sit in a chair in the backyard and you hand her a pair of razor scissors. God help me if she remembers anything I might have done in the last 25 years. But for me, I was going to say, it's actually, instead of going to work and being so busy with so many things, and this project and that project, and desperately hoping to have the impetus and the energy and the time to get to the gym, the stir craziness of this now is forcing me. Now every day I'm out walking or running around the neighborhood. It was 37 degrees Fahrenheit today. I was out running around my neighborhood today, laps. So it's actually better for me health-wise, I think, being in prison, if you will, here.
Yeah, I mean, I
don't know if it has anything to do with, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that, again, I think it's going to be interesting for a lot of reasons. One is that when you look at it, it's like, okay, there are an awful lot of people who have 2-hour commutes every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to a bunch of people, and I'm hearing people say, gee, it's sort of nice not having to waste that much of my time every day.
Yeah.
And not having to sit in traffic all that time, and not having to worry about buying gas and, upkeep and so on and so forth. And you know what? It turns out that all of those interminable meetings and so on and so forth really could have been handled by an email.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hearing from people who say, well, gee, I'm actually more productive than I used to be, and I'm being more productive in wildly less time. Why in the world am I ever going to want to go back to working the way that I used to? And so I hear a lot of that. The other thing is, okay, if you look at this, it's going to be a long time before it makes sense to get large groups of people together again.
When will we have an American Astronomical Society meeting with,
We
2,000 people there ever again?
Why would you want one?
Mm.
Now I'm not being facetious there, because
I still think there are some things that are just done better in person, though. There are a lot of things, and I think certain types of meetings may be one of those things in a way.
But I agree with you. The flip side of that, though, is how many you go off to a business meeting, and it's going to be a 2 or 3 day business meeting or a AAS meeting or whatever. And to do that means that you have to take a week out of your time, because there's the flight to get out there, which may well be a red eye, and there's the flight to get back, and there's all the time, living in a hotel and so on and so forth. And so the time cost of that is absolutely enormous. The monetary cost of that is absolutely enormous. All of this to pack all of this interesting talking into some very short amount of time. So when I go to meetings, I never do get to actually spend as much time talking to people as I would like to.
Right. Yeah.
And, if you think about it, it's like, okay, so what if, for example, we said, let's have an American Astronomical Society meeting. And let's spread the AAS meeting out over a couple of weeks, and let's have online talks. Let's find a way to do poster sessions and things like that online in a sensible way. Let's set up ways of interacting that are different from the ways that we have been used to. I could imagine, certainly people are just, one of the first things people discovered was that sitting around in front of Zoom drinking is a perfectly reasonable way to drink.
Although trying to get a job through, say, a poster session might be very difficult in a virtual environment. So
Why?
I feel like, because again, there's a lot of, to me, again, there's a lot of just trying to think of how to put this in a good way. The randomness and almost the random meetings that actually happen to me at, say, the AAS, for example, are actually usually much better than the intentional ones. And so when everything becomes very intentional, you lose those random interactions that may be beneficial.
So you just tossed a challenge out there, which is finding a way to bring random interactions into a virtual setting.
Right. And again, there may be a way to do that. Maybe we'll figure out how to do that. The other option is we become much more intentional about how we run meetings. Maybe there's only one AAS meeting a year as opposed to two. Something like that. I feel like you could probably find a balance rather than going, let's completely scrap all meetings and go all virtual. I feel like we could kind of find a better balance, maybe. Make one of those meetings virtual and one not, and see how that goes.
Let me ask a devil's advocate question, because this all makes a lot of logistical and logical sense, but we are social animals. Is that enough psychologically for people to have 80% of their meetings virtually, or all of their large meetings that would involve dozens or hundreds or thousands of people permanently from now on remotely? Would there be something that people would feel that they sort of lost internally from too much of this?
I think so. I would argue that there is.
Yeah, I mean, I am clearly, for purposes of conversation, I'm staking out a position. So I'm going to stick with that position for a minute. I guess I would come back and say that people, if you really look at the way that people evolved, who we are, we do not meaningfully interact socially in groups of 2,000. We interact meaningfully in groups that are much smaller than that. And so I could imagine, for example, that, in-person workshops where you get a smaller cadre of people together would make a lot more sense, would still make sense. Another thing that's going to happen, I mean, there were already a lot of organizations that were saying, for purely financial reasons, instead of sending everybody off to that meeting, well, you're the one who gets to go to the meeting for the company this year.
That's what we do, yeah.
And that has happened like blazes at astronomy. Things that I've done in my spare time during this period is to clean my basement for the first time in 30 years. And what I could do is actually tell you what happened during the week of June 7th, 1993 at Astronomy Magazine, if you really wanted to know. That's the level of stuff that I kept forever.
More people went to the AAS.
That I really needed. And among those numerous thousands of papers were, here's the staff travel schedule for 1986 and 1989. We were sending people all over. There were, 3 editors going to the Texas Star Party sometimes. The things that would be completely nonsensical now. So that, just to back up your point, Jeff.
Yeah, and so in a sense, harking back to, gee, I would really prefer X, if in many of these cases, X is already gone.
Right.
And when you talk about meetings and things like that, I mean, there's another aspect of this that we could probably do a whole show on. And that is, gee, if people aren't commuting so much, and if people aren't flying so much, now is probably not a good time to invest in the airlines. Now is probably not a good time to invest in big luxury hotel properties and
ships.
meeting facilities and things like that.
Yep.
Which is maybe a whole not show we could do sometime. But the thing is from a climate standpoint, maybe COVID is the thing that's finally going to get us to change our behaviors in ways that could have a real impact there.
Mm.
And the thing is, again, you look at it and it's like, okay, a lot of this stuff was going away anyway, so there's no going back to it. I think that on balance, we are at the very first of this thing, which means that we have yet to even begin to figure out how do you bring a lot of the things like Allison was talking about back into a virtual environment.
Mm-hmm.
and really make it work. Socializing, we don't socialize in those groups anyway. Going to neat places, we'd probably save so much money not getting on airplanes and going off and hanging out in the Chicago airport or whatever it is that you do these days. Maybe if an organization saves enough money from doing that, they can bring themselves to say, hey, let's all go to Hawaii for a week or some such. But the other thing is that we are creatures of habit. It's people imagine that the consciousness is somehow in control and it's sitting there in the driver's seat and so on and so forth. It's actually not true. The vast majority of what we do, we're just running habit loops, man.
And we do what feels comfortable. And if it works and it feels comfortable, we do it again.
And it works. And it gets to the point that that's kind of fun. That's something we ought to talk about on one of these shows, is get into some neuroscience. But it's really kind of fascinating because people think that they're making conscious decisions, and then you put them in an fMRI and watch what their brains are doing, and you discover, well, yeah, you think you just consciously made that decision, but in fact your brain made that decision for you several seconds ago. And not only that, but looking at the fMRI, I could have told you what your decision was going to be before you knew it. We run on habit loops. And so a lot of the things that we're talking about here, as we develop new habits, as we learn that, okay, you do what I do, which is get up and walk into your office and close the door, and now you're at work and you do. Those habits are going to replace old habits. And I'm guessing that when the opportunity 18 months downstream or whenever it is that we have a vaccine comes along, that it's going to be as hard to go back or to want to go to, it would be as hard to go back to how things were some months ago as it seems to be making the transition to where we are now, I suspect.
Well, and especially if where you are now is more efficient and less costly for organizations.
Yep.
Then why go back?
Why go back? Imagine you're an organization and you were thinking about building a big new building. Okay. That was going to be really expensive. And you just realize that, you know what, if you start having people come in 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week to do the things that they have to do in person, you don't have to build that big new building. Your overhead just went down. And so on and so forth. And so I think that a lot of organizations, for just plain old economic reasons, are going to discover that there are changes going on right now that are not bad changes.
So you've interrupted our afternoon today, you two, to tell us that we're on an inevitable path to a completely new world and there's no turning back.
That's the gist. And we've hit 30 minutes right now. So speaking of
no, it's that is the way that it works. I mean, I yet another show that we can do. What I do
think we're going to have to adapt.
We're going to have to adapt.
But I think we can adapt, and I think we can be very intentional about how we adapt. And again, we can bring some things back. I mean, again, small meetings, maybe those things do work best, and maybe we'll learn that we just need to be more intentional and just set these things up differently to set everything up for success, as opposed to kind of just throwing everything out there and relying on, say, random interactions or whatever it
Yeah.
takes.
Yeah. I like your word intentional, because that really is, if things just kind of gradually go along and morph, then the future is always different from the past. We've been poised for any number of huge shifts in our economy for a long time anyway. You look at things like, for example, the predictions that AI is going to put something like 40 or 50% of jobs are going to go away. And this time they're not blue collar jobs. This time they're white collar jobs. AIs are going to start doing things like writing articles and editing them, at which point we're all out of jobs.
You give me another few years, they can have it. Okay?
But only his job, not mine.
Only his job, not yours.
I'll be beside a pool in Tucson.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can visit me there. Yeah.
But you look at that, there are all sorts of things that people are talking about, true hyper productivity. And so the fact is that we were already coming into a point where with a modest fraction of the population working, we could produce more goods and services than the entire population could ever consume. And when you find yourself in that situation, which is the situation that we're coming into, you then need to go back and rethink some things like our strange commitment to Calvinism, the idea that somehow my right to eat and have a roof over my head depends upon the money that I'm making for somebody else. That's a strange notion in the world that we're coming into, but it has such inertia behind it. And I think one of the things that COVID is doing, this is just one example, is it is going to force us to reevaluate some things like that. It's going to take time when we discover that we can't open again in a few months. And so 18 months from now, we will be doing things differently. And I don't think there will be going back. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
That is a tremendous, profound thought to perhaps end on. I think our first step, Apollo 13, and we talked about this transformative world that we're in, and we're going through a tunnel, and we don't know exactly where we're coming out. But I know one thing: I'll hope that I will be doing a show with you two still, whatever happens.
Absolutely. And one thing I know is that next time I'm not going to have my web browser open when we start so that I get echoes. All right.
Hey, this has been great. It's been really fun. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Jeff. And let's do it again very soon, huh?
Absolutely. Thank the both of you. This was great fun.
Yes, thank you.
And for whoever is out there.
Awesome.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Talk to you
See
soon.
you soon.